Welcome to the Bernie's Bootlegs podcast, where we explore the stories of successful musicians and share their perspectives on being an artist in a digital age. I'm your host, Kenny McCabe, and let's get into the show. In today's episode, we're speaking with saxophonist and composer Noah Preminger. We discussed growing up in Connecticut, what he practiced in high school and college, what he learned from David Liebman, the transcription method he used, how he developed a unique voice and vocabulary, his time at New England Conservatory, his early years in New York City, the value of writing a tune a day, what it means to be a true artist, why you need to be recording your gigs, his brand new record, and much more. You can find Noah on his website at noahpreminger.com and also on Instagram at Noah_Preminger. And so without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Noah Preminger. Okay, guys, I'm here with Noah Preminger. Noah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for having me.
How are you, man?
I'm good. I'm doing great. Yeah, I just got married.
Wow, that's incredible. How recently?
A couple weeks ago. Yeah, we've been doing a number of parties, and we had our last little party yesterday. So now
that's
I'm
awesome.
fully married.
Yeah, congratulations. How's that been?
It's great. Yeah, that's the new news. Yeah.
Right on, and I have to give a brief disclaimer. If you guys if you're listening to the audio version, you won't notice, but for the video version, Noah has a friendly, furry friend that is roaming around. So there's the cat. So if you see a cat walking back and forth, do not be alarmed.
Nice.
So yeah, man, I wanted to start with where you grew up and how you got into music, because you are from Connecticut, I believe.
Yeah, I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut. The school I grew up, the public school I went to for high school, there's a lot of inspiring players that went there, like Richie Barchet and Drew Sayers, Garrett Sayers, Brad Meldau, Joel Fromm, Andrew Smiley, just a long list of pretty awesome improvisers. So,
was your family musically inclined? Were either of your parents musicians? Where did the interest in the saxophone originate?
Yeah, my folks are big music lovers. They jazz music and a lot of other kinds of music too. But they don't play. And I don't know, I grew up sort of, when I was in middle school, grade school, I didn't have a lot of friends, and I grew up in a pretty rural area. And so there wasn't a lot to do other than like go skiing and practice and mountain bike in the woods. So I sort of had a little bit of a loner thing happening when I was young, which allowed for me to practice a lot. So,
where did the interest in saxophone originate? Was it like a recording that you heard and you were just like, "Hey, I like that"?
I wanted to play the drums, and I actually auditioned for drums and I didn't make it. So I was like, well, you know what? I'll just play the saxophone. That seems like the second coolest instrument. And no, I didn't have like one of these, like I heard John Coltrane and I was like inspired to play kind of thing, you know. It's just, I was like, all right, I'll play the saxophone. So I started on alto. I actually grew up in a town called Canton, which is maybe 30, 40 minutes away from Hartford. And the music program there wasn't so great for various reasons. And so the director of the music program at Hall High School in West Hartford was actually living in Canton, heard me play, and he said, why don't you guys make the move to West Hartford? So I went to Hall for high school, and they asked me to switch to tenor. So I guess I was maybe 13 or so, which is when I switched over.
Did your family actually move, or did you just switch high schools?
Yeah, so my parents are like, you know, extremely dedicated and supportive. So they rented out the house in Canton and bought a little tiny house in West Hartford so I could go to school there.
Wow.
And then sold that house when I graduated from high school, and then moved back to the house they were renting out in Canton. So, hmm
Do you have siblings?
no, I'm an only child, if you couldn't
Gotcha.
tell
Yeah.
from that story.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
understand.
yeah.
So, as you said, kind of in that general area, there wasn't too much to do. And I was checking out your bio on your website. It says you're practicing like 8 hours a day. So, I wanted to ask you, what were you practicing?
Oh, what was I practicing for 8 hours a day? I mean, just learning tunes. But I guess before learning tunes, practicing scales. Um, I had heard those stories about Train practicing scales all day long. Um, and I figure, if it worked for Train, maybe it could work for me. So just practicing scales and articulation, different ways to articulate. I never practiced like tone stuff. Never practiced long tones or any of that. But I think that in a way I did just from practicing other stuff so much. And then that sort of transitioned from practicing like 6, 8 hours a day into just practicing in my head and on my fingers. So when I got into college, I think that sort of transition began, and so it was less practicing on the horn and maybe just more composition on the piano. Um, and started working a little more beginning in college. Um, so that was a form of practice as well. Yeah.
Definitely. And so you had mentioned several really amazing musicians that had gone to that same high school in West Hartford. So was the music program relatively strong there? Were there folks that were similarly interested in what you were doing? Were you playing a lot? And did you start gigging
Yeah.
in high school and that sort of thing?
Yeah. Well, we had a jazz band director that his tactic was he was Armenian, and he would just scare the shit out of you into practicing, basically. And that's very effective if done right. So I was just fucking panicked the whole time. Like, if I don't learn this, I'm in deep trouble. Um, so that was sort of what got me going even more. But yeah, the program is really special. Um, and the band would go to Europe every other year, and like did the whole went to the White House and all that kind of stuff. So um, and that started from the ground up. I didn't go to the middle school in that town, but apparently they have a really strong program there, and so yeah, I think I don't know what's going on with that with the program anymore. It's different people running it now. So yeah.
Gotcha. Well, anyway, I mean that's awesome. I mean to have that kind of those kind of resources and just interest in music available to you.
Extremely grateful for having that. I mean, most people don't. So
Yeah. So were you also studying a little bit with Dave Liebman around this time?
yeah, I studied with Liebman at the beginning of high school through the end of high school. When I started high school, somebody introduced me to him, and I think I was 12 or 13, and I went out and did his saxophone workshop at his house in Pennsylvania, and he really ripped me one or two or three. And so what we would do is, I mean, this is before cell phones, I think. Um, so what he would do is he would call me because it was, I don't know, 6 hour drive or something like that. So instead of going like driving out there every week, he would call me and he would say, okay, I want you to do this transcription and this and this and that, and mail it to me when you're done with it. And so I would do it and I would mail it to him, and then he would call me a few weeks later after he got it, and we would go over it on the phone and basically have like a phone lesson and just talk about it. And then would give me more things to do. And that went on for maybe 3 or 4 years. So I don't know if you or other people are familiar with Liebman's sort of transcription method, but it's pretty extensive, and that was great for me.
Yeah, I think if anyone wants to check it out, he has a really detailed article on his site about how he thinks about transcription. And if I understand it correctly, the gist of it is just to be as exact as possible, not just in terms of the notes, but also in terms of inflection and, dynamics and articulation and everything, and just try and mimic every aspect of the solo to the best of your ability. Is that more or less correct?
That's part of it, yes. But the most important part of his process is the variations aspect. And this is how I teach as well. I think it's the only way to teach improvisation if your goal is to teach individuality. Because I mean, for me, and I assume for Liebman, I don't want to speak on behalf of him, but the reason why you improvise is to have your own unique voice. And so the way that he taught me and I teach my students is when you transcribe, and after you learn it by ear and then write it down and analyze the solo, and write a paper about it and the whole 9 yards, you take the parts of the improvisation that you like the most, and you learn them in all 12 keys, learn that line in all 12 keys, and then you create variations on it. So first you're learning exactly what they did, and then, the first one is you have the original line, and then under it, maybe you change it in a very small way. So maybe every fifth note of the line, you lower a half step or something. Or maybe you do something rhythmically to the line that changes it slightly. But there's tons of shit you can do. I mean, you could, every third note, raise it an octave or lower it an octave, and what you end up doing is you create your own language, which eventually doesn't sound anything like the original line, but it's you because you created it. And then the ones that you like that you come up with, learn those in all 12 keys. So you're really building a vocabulary that's unique to you, but comes from like the masters or whoever you're into,
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to do and a really interesting way to go about it, because you're kind of, the way I think about it, personalizing the transcription, but on two layers. So the first layer is that whatever you select out of that transcription to modify or to put in all 12 keys, etc., your selections are going to be personal to you. And so if you have two people or three people listen to the same solo, and you asked each one of them at the end of that solo what their favorite line is from that solo, their favorite several bars, everyone's going to say something different most likely. And so
Sure.
you have your personalized selection on that level, but then also any alterations that you make to that are going to be personalized to you as well. And it's going to be whatever, appeals the most to your personal sensibility. So that is a really, I think, valuable thing to do, and I suggest everybody try and do it. Although it's very time consuming, it can be very time consuming, and it's very thorough, very in depth. So it can take a while, but you'll be happy with the results, I think.
Yeah, it's the best way to, and the most effective way to create your own vocabulary, which I think is what people want. I mean, the biggest slap in the face is like, "Hey, man, you sound great. Have you been checking a lot of Sonny Rollins out lately?" Or, "Hey man, you sound so killing on that last night. Man, have you been checking out a lot of Joe Lovano?" Or but the best compliment on the other hand that you can get is, "Hey man, I love your playing. You don't sound like anybody but yourself." And that's how I found that you get to that place is through that process. So yes, it's time consuming, but if you want to take this whole thing seriously, then sort of what you got to do.
I completely agree. And so I'd love to fast forward a little bit to college and those years, because they are often very, very important, and for one reason or another. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your college experience and your early 20s as a whole.
So I didn't want to live in New York City right after high school. And the only school I wanted to go to was NEC. Because they valued that idea of having your own unique voice. And so that was the only school I wanted to go to. I ended up going there for 4 years. And, I didn't do a lot of playing outside of NEC when I was in college. There was a lot of yeah, I don't remember it too well. But there was a lot of growing, and I had the opportunity to play with some of the faculty there at the time. I got to spend a few years playing in a band with Bob Moses, who is a trip, and we don't talk anymore. But those were valuable sessions that we played together. Just for me, as a person, learning from basically learning about him as a person, and figuring out what I like and what I don't like as a professional. And musically, I mean, Bob Moses is one of the most inspiring people to share a stage with. So Moses and people like Danilo Perez and people like I don't know, there were a lot of really great musicians there. So then I left NEC, and before I left NEC, I was sort of became really close with a trumpet player named John McNeil. And when I moved to New York City, John and I had a steady gig every Wednesday night at a little jazz club in Brooklyn. And that lasted almost a year. I think it was about 10 months. And through that gig, I got to meet a lot of players. Well, I should back up and say, before I left NEC, I made a record. John urged me to record a bunch of my original music, and I hired some of the players that I really admired at the time, and obviously still do. Ted Poore was the drummer, and John Hebert was the bassist on that record. Frank Kimbrough played piano. Ben Monder was the guitar player, and a trumpet player named Russ Johnson. Anyway, so that was an expensive business card for me to go to New York City with, and got some great press, and that kind of like helped get my name out a little bit, which was nice when I moved. And then I had this steady gig with McNeil, and that was an opportunity for me to play with a ton of different musicians that I had never even heard of, but it's like a nice little intro to New York City. People like Jochen Ruckert or Rudy Royston or Joe Martin, Fred Hirsch. A lot of people did that gig with us, and so it was an opportunity to meet people like, for example, Fred. And then Fred Hirsch called me to do some gigs with his band right after that. So it was just a nice way. I was lucky, very fortunate to have that opportunity, and fortunate for John McNeil to give me that opportunity. Especially listening back to some of those recordings I made then, man, I'm sad. Super sad. So, so thank you, John, for having me play with you, man. Yeah.
Shout out to John. Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully, maybe he'll come on the podcast someday.
Oh yeah, that would be a treat. Yeah.
Cool, man. So I wanted to ask you about this time, which I guess after you moved to New York, you were what, like 23 around?
I moved when I was 21. Yeah.
Oh, 21. Okay, gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. So right after you graduated NEC.
The day I graduated, I moved. Yeah, that day. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think the most important things you were doing at the time were? Was it mostly just a ton of playing, just trying to play in every possible context? Was it a lot of writing? Was it just everything? What kind of things were you working
on? Yeah, around that time I made that record, and I was talking with a record label called Palmetto about doing a record, and that got me composing a lot. I had been writing a lot in college anyway. I mean, there were a couple years there where I was writing a tune a day, finishing a tune a day. And so I had a huge file of my own music, but for those records, I did 2 records for Palmetto. That really got me motivated to compose more. So I was writing a lot when I moved, and hanging, just trying to make friends. That's something, and I guess you're asking me to recommend what to do when you move to New York City, but try to make friends. New York is a scary, scary little place. And so having friends just as a support system is really helpful. But, having friends that you can play with, that inspire you, so hanging at places like 55 Bar and Smalls and the Vanguard and stuff like that. That was pretty much, the first number of years I was there. And then I tried booking a bunch of tours in Europe right when I moved to New York City. Had a bunch of booking agents that didn't do much for me. So I did most of that for myself. And that was great. I had been to Europe a few other times, but never like that, performing for European audiences, which is a whole different thing. And then basically just doing sideman work, recording, building up my own discography. And it kind of just, one thing kind of turns into the next,
Yeah, so going back to the composing thing, you were doing a lot of writing, of course, at the time, finishing a tune a day. A lot of people will hear that and they'll be like, "What the heck, Noah? How do you do that? How do you do that?
Well, I'm not saying they're good, but
right.
but it's a thing. It's to be able to try to finish that song in a day, and of course, a lot of times, you have an idea and it's incomplete. I'm not saying this is how you should compose, but at that time, I was trying. My teacher at the time, Jerry Bergonzi, was like, "Man, just sit down and try to write a tune a day and try to finish it." And it trains you to like compose a certain way, and that's not the only way you should compose. Anyway, so I had a lot of stuff, and a lot of those tunes that I felt like I had finished, I later went back and tweaked or turned into other songs, or combined with other songs, or used as a bass line for another, stuff like that. But it was just a way for me to basically motivate myself to do work, So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, composition for me is really important. It helps you become a more well-rounded artist, not just like a player. There's a lot of players that can really play, but I wouldn't necessarily call them an artist, because I think that maybe they're lacking in other departments. Whereas you have people that are like true artists because they have the whole package. I mean, just off the top of my head, somebody that kind of fits that bill to me is someone like Dave Douglas. I mean, Dave Douglas has composed a lot. He's, he can really play too, but he, like, to me, has the whole package. So whether or not you like his playing or his writing or whatever, you can't disagree with the fact that he is a very well-rounded artist,
Yeah, it's kind of like the difference between like an artist and a saxophonist almost is kind of how I think about it. Like, and there are many people that are saxophonists that I have great respect for, and if that makes them happy, then that's awesome. I mean, more power to them. But if you want to be more on the artist side, then I would say composing is something you should definitely be doing, or at least spending some time on.
Absolutely. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I guess as far as the composing thing goes, writing a tune a day. Obviously, every tune, like you mentioned, is not going to be the greatest tune in the world, but it's still
won't.
Yeah, it's still kind of right, of course, but it's still kind of flexing the composing muscle, maybe, or even if that particular tune that you wrote one day, even if as a tune itself it might be a crappy tune, that's at least perhaps like a motive or something that could be used in another context, in another tune, and regardless, like, you're still getting a lot out of it, even if you're not going to be recording, like all of those tunes that you're writing each day.
Right. Yeah. It just, you're training yourself, and you're also you're learning more about yourself as a composer. I mean, it's the same thing as like practicing at home or recording yourself practicing at home, or recording your gigs and listening back. You're just writing it down on paper and doing it on the piano. It's something that you can look back on and learn from and grow from. So yeah, and that's another thing. I mean, I record every gig. I videotape every gig, and listen back immediately, right after the gig, back in my hotel or back at home or on the car ride home. Immediately after every gig I play, I listen back, unless I know just like this was a fucking nightmare gig or something, you know what I mean? And I know why, but still, like I like to try to force myself to listen to it. And that really helps me, grow, of course.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of like giving yourself, feedback, I guess. And it's definitely something that I would recommend everyone do, because you have to be able to, because I don't know, when you're in the moment, when you're on the gig, right, and you're play a solo, you're not experiencing that solo in the same way as you experience it when you're listening, like in the car on the way home or whatever. Like it's more of like more of an objective view. And I find that the level of objectivity you can have about your playing increases over time. So if you listen to a gig that you did 6 months or a year or more ago, you're going to be able to look at that much more objectively than, the same night or like the day after, I find anyway.
Yeah. I mean, for example, I played last week. I have a project that I co-run with a really great drummer named Rob Garcia. It's called the Dead Composers Club. And we did a record of Chopin's music a couple years ago. And so we were asked to play a concert at a university in Western Pennsylvania called Washington and Jefferson, a college. And I thought the gig was awful. Most of it during the gig did not feel good at all. And I should say, I thought that the other players sounded really great, but my playing, I thought, was not feeling comfortable. And especially my articulation. That's something that I've always thought a lot about. I mean, back to when I was like in college, I remember I was checking out like a lot of players like Warren Marsh that don't articulate a lot, and that got me into this thing where like there wasn't any kind of attack with my playing, and it wasn't swinging at all. And so I had somebody mention to me like, man, why don't you do this and this? And so I took the steps to really like study articulation. And so lately, the past year or so, I've been feeling like, something's not happening with my articulation again. And so I'm listening specifically for that. So I listened, but it was a 10-hour drive out there and a 10-hour drive back. So I had plenty of time on the drive back late at night to listen to the concert. And actually, the whole concert was really happening. Like every aspect of the gig was pretty nice. And my articulation was actually like, I was happy with it. I was like, I'm doing the things that I've been thinking about. It doesn't sound on the other side of the horn like I'm struggling the way that I imagined during the gig. So it's just another perspective, that you're getting from listening back. It can be very helpful.
Super helpful. And so the last thing I want to touch on is just you actually have a brand new record out from, I think it was released early this month, early October. Can you just tell us a little bit about the concept behind that record? What kind of stuff is on it? Is it all new stuff? Is it a mix? Who's on it? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So almost a decade ago, I was playing a gig in the Village, and I met a guy named Steve Lampert who happened to be at the gig. He was friends with Ben Monder, and can't remember who the drummer on the gig was. But anyway, we established a really close friendship over the past decade. And he's somebody I value a lot as a friend, but as well as, I think that he's one of the most thoughtful, deepest musicians and composers and artists in the history of jazz music. And so anyway, I recorded on a couple of Steve's records over the past 3 or 4 years. John O'Gallagher and I were actually like the featured soloist on his records over these past 2 records. And I asked Steve a few years back, about 3 or 4 years ago, if he wanted to write a piece for my ensemble because I really admire his writing, and I was really fortunate to have him say yes. And he spent a few years working on this piece. Hey, buddy. Hi. This is Chippy, by the way. She's
Hello.
She's an attention whore, but she deserves it. Anyway, Steve Lampert wrote this really magical piece, and the ensemble is myself on tenor. John O'Gallagher's the alto player. He's one of my favorite, if not my favorite, saxophone players in the world. Jason Palmer is the trumpeter. Jason's been on my last maybe 4 or 5 records. And let's see who else is on it. Chris Davis is the pianist. She's one of my favorite improvisers. Rob Schwimmer plays Hocken Continuum and clavinet. Kim Cass is the bassist. Kim and I went to college together, and I'm a huge fan of his playing. He's also been on a bunch of my records. And Rudy Royston's the drummer. And Steve Lampert wrote the composition. It's just one piece of music. I shouldn't say just one piece. It is one piece of music. And also recorded all the synthesizer parts. So anyway, it's one piece of music. It's around 50 minutes from start to finish. And I'm extremely proud of this record. It's different than anything else I've done, and I feel like way more serious than any other project I've had. Not to diminish other things, but this one is, it's the newest one, and maybe the last one. You never know. So,
what's it called, Noah?
It's called Zigsaw, the music of Steve Lampert. And so anyway, there's a story behind the record from Steve's perspective that he discusses in the liner notes a little bit. And so anyway, if you're interested in getting a copy, I saw it on my website, and I think it's like on iTunes and all the usual places. But yeah, Zigsaw.
Right on, man. I would definitely suggest everyone check that out. I have not checked it out yet, but I'm sure I will very, very soon. And if you want to, if it's streaming, don't just stream it. Just go, because if you stream it and if you like it, go buy a copy. That's always my recommendation.
Yeah. I hope somebody develops a different platform sometime soon. But as of now, look, I mean, I have a Spotify account, and I think it's great for finding new music. But when I find something that I really like, I buy it from the musician's website first. It's the first place I go to. So
exactly.
So I recommend doing that.
Definitely, and the links to your website and all that will be in the show notes, of course. If people want to go check that out. And so I think that's all we have time for today. I really appreciate you coming on, Noah, sharing all of your wisdom with us about composition and a lot of other important topics that we touched on. So thank you so much for your time. Yeah,
my pleasure, and thank you for your dedication to discussing the music. And I've seen all the stuff you've done, and it's really helpful. And thank you for doing all that work.
Yeah, man, my pleasure. Stay on the line for 1 second. Thanks again.
Okay.
Thank you so much for checking out the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you happen to be listening to this. And if you enjoyed the podcast, consider giving it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. For more episodes, please visit berniesbootlegs.com. Thanks again, and see you guys next time.